So it's entitled Green and Sustainable Finance. I had a peek at the presentations of my panelists here, and I must say that they're covering the topic almost exhaustively. So that will make my introduction very easy, so I can hold you for your expertise here. So maybe I'll set the broad framework. There was a figure that was actually mentioned during a few times, a couple of times, during earlier discussions during this forum. And the figure was $1.7 trillion. What was that? It's a study from Asian Development Bank that came up that an estimate of funding needs for infrastructure in the Asian region to support economic growth and to continue poverty reduction. And the answer is $1.7 trillion of infrastructure investments are needed every year until 2030 to achieve that objective. That's a total of 26 trillion, of which little less than $15 trillion for power investments and 8.4 trillion for transportation. So altogether, power and transportation about 90%. What is the challenge here? Well, it's not common. First, we need to find the funding to do that. Do we have it? Well, about 40% is missing. We have about $950 billion, which is available to cover investments by government themselves, by country themselves, and also by international investors. But we're missing 750, 800 billion. So that's the first challenge, where to find that. Second challenge is how to make those investments in, once again, power and transportation without inflicting further damage to the environment, i.e. supporting a global transition to a sustainable development path, or at least limiting damages, further damages to the environment. And here, as I said, my panelists have fantastic presentations, but none of them talks about ADB. So I thought I would just take the language of the moderator here to say a few words about what ADB does with respect to that topic. Well, first, generally speaking, ADB supports its developing member countries that seek to mitigate and adapt to the consequences of climate change through a transition to low carbon and climate resilient growth. What are we talking about? I'm not going to go exhaustively through all the investments that ADB does, but when we talk about mitigation, we're talking, for example, about financing of renewable power plants, whether it's solar, geothermal, wind, or small hydro. When we talk about adaptation to climate change, that means how to learn to cope with it, how to be more resilient. You could think about, for example, better flood resilient sewage system in city environments, and so forth. ADB has committed by 2020 that 30% of its operations will address climate change issues. 30%, that means about $6 billion a year. Currently, we're already doing well. In 2017, we had close to $5 billion of operations in climate change, about a bit north of $4 billion for mitigation and a bit less than $1 billion for adaptation. Now, remember the other challenge I mentioned about how do we get the extra funding that is missing now? But then we turn to the topic now, green bonds. I talked about the asset side of the balance sheet. Where do we invest? Where do we get it? Well, green bonds are a great tool. What are they? They're simply debt securities, like any other debt securities, but whose proceeds are used to finance projects or assets with positive environmental benefits. So clearly what I just mentioned about what ADB is doing. So just a few words about what we've been doing with our Green Bond program. Our Green Bond program has been launched in 2015. As we're speaking, so far we have issued about in excess of $3.2 billion of green bonds, which once again the proceeds are allocated into a special pool, waiting for disbursements to fund the nice projects I mentioned, addressing the issues related to climate change. We issued in 6 different currencies so far. US dollar, mainly. Also Hong Kong dollar, Australian dollar, Swedish krona, Turkish lira, and Indian rupee. That's an interesting one. We issue a green bond in Indian rupee, we kept the proceeds in Indian rupee, and we use them to fund, as far as I remember, a solar power project there. And actually, there was so good demand for that bond that we were able to tap it in the second time. And we also use those proceeds for same funding purposes. So we're doing well in that regard. However, ADB is part of the supranational community, which are, as we will see in a minute, still the issuers, which are the largest segment of the market, of the green bond market. And to give you a more overall background of this market, I will now call Mark to give you a presentation, and I hope I didn't steal too much of it.
Great. Thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you actually for you didn't steal too much of my presentation, but you did a great job of setting the scene of what we're looking at here for green finance. So I'll kick off. I'm Mark Austin, as already been introduced, the CEO of SIFMA. And basically who we are is we are a trade association focused on capital market development in this region. We bring together the sell side, the buy side, the market infrastructures like the credit rating agencies like S&P here, as well as law firms and all those that are really kind of creating the ecosystem of capital markets in this region. In addition, we're the Asian member of the GFMA, which brings together SIFMA in the United States, obviously it's part of our name, and AFME in Europe, and collectively we're the largest sort of financial market, capital market trade association globally. For my sins, I'm also the CEO of the GFMA right now, which is on a rotational basis for every 2 years between those 3 trades. So that's sort of who we are, and maybe moving right along to sort of green finance. I mean, I personally believe this is really the future. That this market is going to grow exponentially over the years forward, and really green finance is all about sustainable finance that really is about keeping our planet inhabitable for not only us but our future generations. And the Paris Agreement is not the only catalyst, but it certainly has been one of the catalysts for the development of the green bond market going forward. It's basically required the nationally determined contributions in relation to climate change, and most of these NDCs, as they're called, have high cost of implementing the plans. So estimates of the total cost globally range in the tens of trillions US dollars, and particularly the $100 trillion bond market will play a critical role in meeting these needs. But that's not the only reason that obviously we are focusing on green finance. There are other aspects that sovereign green bonds can fund, including renewable energy, clean transportation, agriculture, afforestation, national parks, reclamation of contaminated lands, and waste management, just to name some of them. So that's sort of the context of what I'd like to talk about today. And what I would like to jump into is that maybe before I talk about the sovereign bonds, green bonds, to really set out the green bond standards. There are a number of sets of green bond standards that issuers can issue subject to. And the sort of the three largest internationally are the ICMA Green Bond Principles, which is the most widely adopted one. Then the recently created ASEAN Green Bond Standards, and then the Climate Bond Standard, which is from the Climate Bonds Initiative, as well as there are some country-specific standards. So these are the standards in which you issue your bonds and that you get the green designation effectively. And I'm going to turn to each of them and give you a little bit more details about them. So if you look at the ICMA Green Bond Principles, it's a voluntary principle based on four main pillars. Use of the proceeds. So as Pierre already spoke about in relation to ADB's work, you need to use the proceeds to provide clear environmental benefits. The Green Bond Principles list several broad categories of eligibility for green projects, but note that it's been designed flexibly to make sure that the list is not exhaustive. So that's the first point. The second point is you need a process for project evaluation and selection. So issuers should clearly communicate environmental sustainability objectives and the process used to determine eligibility products and eligibility criteria used. So these should be clearly communicated in what you're doing in relation to the process. You also need to manage the proceeds. Net proceeds to be credited to a sub-account, so it's separate from anything else you're doing, and moved to a separate portfolio or otherwise tracked by the issuer. So you need to be, and use of an auditor to do that is required. So you basically need to keep this separate from your other funds, which I know is, and we can talk about in questions, is a challenge sometimes for sovereigns. And then finally, you need reporting. Issuers should keep readily available, up-to-date information on the use of proceeds, and this is to be renewed annually. So effectively, you need to use the proceeds for green projects, you need a process for the project evaluation and selection, manage the proceeds, and then report, and then an external review is recommended. And as I mentioned, the ICMA Green Bond Principles are the ones that have been the most widely used to date. So if we go on to the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, the really positive thing about this is that they've been built off of the ICMA ones. So there's not completely separate standards. They've been really used ICMA as the basis, but they've tweaked them for the ASEAN region. So there are a few things I'm just going to point out that are sort of different from ICMA. One is that, not surprisingly, they've got to be connected to the ASEAN region. The second thing is, and interestingly, is fossil fuel power generation projects are specifically excluded. So as we'll see later on, that's not always the case for every set of standards. It also requires issuers to disclose information on use and management of proceeds, project evaluation and selection, like ICMA, but it also encourages issuers to provide more frequent periodic reporting. And it does recommend external reviews as well. But it also, in addition, sets in place expertise and experience requirements for reviewers. So pretty much built on the ICMA ones, but with a few differences and unique parts, which actually in some ways have gone farther than ICMA has. So that's the Green Bond Standards, and then on to the Climate Bond Standards. So these are from the Climate Bonds Initiative. I won't go through them in detail. But as you can see, it is a bit more prescriptive than what we've seen with the ICMA. For example, there's a certification process where you need to use an approved verifier, which you don't have within the ICMA process. There's more prescriptive requirements on the selection of projects and the internal controls, proceeds, tracking, and reporting. And then on the sector side, it's not as flexible, it's much more sector specific. So those are the three main international standards that people are issuing under. But in addition, what we've seen is that there are green bond standards for individual countries. So China, in particular, has been very much a leader in this field in relation to green finance. Has produced standards which have some differences from the international standards, including the allowance for clean coal, which you don't generally find in some of the other standards. And to be honest and fair to China, it's probably understandable in the current situation they are in terms of their development. You can't expect them to go from quite extensive use of coal to no use of coal overnight. So that's one of the key differences. India and Indonesia have also published their own green bond standards, but those are very closely aligned with the ICMA ones. And Malaysia has built further on this by offering tax and financial incentives to green issuers. So I'll come back to some of those incentive schemes sort of at the end of my presentation. So if we maybe then go on and look at the size of the market, and you can see from a very low base in 2012, the market has been growing very rapidly. And if you look at this, from 2015 to 2016 to 2017, there's been quite significant growth in this market. And that's across the loan market, the sovereigns, government-backed entities, local governments, development banks, non-finance corporates, financial corporates, and ABS. I mean, they're all, if you see on 2017, fairly large slices of the total now. Where before it was, quite often you see back in 2013, it was really the development banks which were leading the way. So maybe to move on to really the sovereign market in particular, which I think we're here to talk about mostly today, as you would have seen on the previous slide, has been a relatively new phenomena, with the first issuance by Poland in 2016. But since then, we've had 6 more issuances, including Poland again. And what you probably have noticed is that some of the unique features of this. Indonesia has been the first ever sovereign green sukuk issuer. Nigeria, which is essentially an oil country, has been using their 81% of their proceeds for solar energy. So it's diversifying from their main economy. Fiji has been the first developing country to issue a green bond, and France, up to date, is the biggest issuer of green bonds globally. If you look at, and there's been 4, and I think even more since I put these slides together, but Sweden, Morocco, Kenya, and Hong Kong have all announced that they're kind of moving into issuing green bonds as well, and made plans to it. And Hong Kong in particular has said they want to issue up to 100 billion Hong Kong dollars, which would make them larger than France if they issue all of that as the largest green bond issuer. So you may ask, well, where's the investor demand coming from? And I think that, obviously this is, as anybody, as you guys as DMO officers, DMOs would know, is that it's a whole supply and demand question, right? So you may have a supply, but is there the demand for it from investors? This is growing very rapidly. And just a few points of fact to point out. Natixis, a French bank, found that 3/4 of the U.S. individual investors want their investments to be in entities with good environmental records that reflect personal values. And that's from the U.S. If we go back to the Paris Agreement, Trump has pulled the U.S. out of that, and the U.S. isn't really seen as a leader in this market by any stretch of the imagination. But when you think 3/4 of individual investors want their investments in green products, I think that shows the way the world is changing. Many investors, asset managers, have made public commitments to green in relation to their investments. The UN Principles for Responsible Investments has now over 1,200 reporting members and 1,750 signatories, representing 70 trillion in assets. And the Global Investor Coalition on Climate Change brings together 4 regional investor groups to support investments responding to climate change. So investor demand is growing. Couple other comments on that. In some of the specific classes, if you look at sovereign wealth funds, Norges Bank has 7 different mandates now for environmental related investments. New Zealand's superannuation funds, new global equity benchmark excludes high carbon companies. it will extend this to fixed income in the coming years. So in sovereign wealth funds, you're starting to see them as leaders in investing in green. If you look at pension funds, Japan's government pension scheme has raised its ESG allocation from 3 to 10%. And Taiwan's Bureau of Labor Funds has appointed 7 asset managers for its 1.43 billion domestic ESG mandate. So that's coming from the pension funds, and those are just the government ones. There are many others that are pension funds that the people who are actually getting those pensions are saying to their pension fund managers, we want those to be invested in green products. If you look at the asset managers, BlackRock launched its Green Bond Index fund in response to the growing demand for investors for this fast-paced growing part of the fixed income market. And Amundi has, with IFC, launched the Amundi Planet Emerging Green 1 Fund, which they expect to invest $2 billion in emerging market green bonds over 7 years. And then if you look at insurers, AXA has a goal to reach €3 billion invested in green assets by 2020, but has now quadrupled this goal to €12 billion. And Zurich has set a goal of investing $5 billion in green bonds and other impact investments with a goal of avoiding 5 billion tons of CO2 emissions annually. So if you look at your traditional kind of investors in government bonds, a lot of them are actually really committing themselves to green mandates. So you can fully expect that going forward, those are likely to grow, and they're going to be looking to you to kind of issue those green bonds going forward. Which brings me perfectly to why issue green bonds. So if you look at the issuers that have done it so far, there's been basically an oversubscription for those bonds. So there's been a lot of interest in it. Poland's bond led to, had pre-issue demand of euro 1.5 billion, leading them to increase the issuance from euro 500 billion to euro 750 billion. And you've seen this with other issuers as well. So it's actually a good diversification play for you as well, because you're attracting in new investors who may not have been actually buying your previous bonds because they have these ESG mandates. And as I said, there seems to be quite a lot of demand, which is growing. The other thing is that we're starting to see price advantages coming into play. Traditionally, many issuers would say to us, well, why issue green, especially in the corporate sector? It's just an additional cost. I have to get these comply with these standards, and I have to pay for that. So why should I do it if it's just going to create more cost for me? Well, one reason was diversification, but what we're starting to see is that environmentally labeled bonds outperform the global bond average, and green bonds on average achieve larger spread tightening during bond building than standard bonds, and this is what we've seen in 2017. And then according to a banker working on Indonesia's US dollar 1.25 billion 5-year issuance, there was remarkable demand, lowered the initial pricing guidelines for investors by 30 basis points. So you're starting to see clear demand that actually may translate into better yields for you, in your issuance going forward. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, which is not on the slide, is 2 things. I mean, one, it sets you out as a market leader, and it really sets the tone because you're the government issuer, that the government's committed to green, which allows corporates, and other issuers within your country to take the view that, well, if the government's backing this and supporting this, it's something that that we should be thinking about doing as well. And then related to that is it gives a risk-free benchmark for the rest of the green bond market within your jurisdiction, in the same way that your government bonds give a benchmark for the corporate bond markets in your jurisdiction as the traditional role that government bond markets have played. So it does that for your green market as well, so it can act as a catalyst to developing your corporate green bond issuance as well. So basically finishing up. So I think that if we kind of look forward, I think there are some public policies that could continue to be used and developed to support this. Talked about the common standards and disclosure requirements. We've seen what's happened here with ASEAN, so I think we can continue to see some of that going forward. We don't want to see too much fragmentation in that space. So if there are more regional or domestic bond standards that are going to be, principles going to be developed, we hope they'll be developed on the back of the ICMA ones or the climate bond initiative ones. We've seen tax and other financial incentives be started to be adopted to encourage issuance and investment. As I said back, when you look at the price, and there might not be such a price differential, how do you encourage issuers in your market to issue? Obviously not the government issuers, but the corporate ones. You see Singapore having a tax incentive scheme, an issuance incentive scheme where they'll pay up to 100,000 Sing dollars to issuers who are issuing for the first green bonds for the first time to cover the additional costs related to issuing. So that's one way of encouraging it. And then we've seen public sector, and so then the public sector investment, the role that you play as a government, if you actually commit to actually doing green bonds and a pipeline of those green bonds coming through, then investors will know that they can count on that, and they'll be more keen, as they are in your own government markets, to continue to support that market going forward. So those are some of the policies that we would recommend for you guys to continue to adopt. So maybe I'll stop there, Pierre. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mark. I would just like to bounce back on your last point. It is true that, unfortunately, Asia, perhaps even South Asia and Southeast Asia, are lagging a bit behind in terms of green bond with respect to, say, the European region. And yes, incentives, some kind of a top-bottom approach is probably needed, and I think public policies right now are going into the right direction in order to sustain further development of this market. It was very interesting to hear about the pricing issue that you mentioned. The next two presentations will talk about that in further detail, so I'll leave it for later. But then I would like to ask you a quick question. You talked about standardization at some point. It looks like we have two main international standards for green bonds. We have the green bond principles and we have the climate bond standards. Is there competition there? Do you think with the, going forward they might merge, might find accommodation? Is it okay that we have those two standards? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think that it's not surprising that we have multiple standards in a market that is really just starting out. So I think that in some ways you could argue it's surprising we haven't had more fragmentation, and that we don't have every country issuing their own policies completely independent from the global standards. So I think having two is not a bad thing. And as I said, I think the Climate Bond Initiative is more prescriptive, and the ICMA one is more flexible. I don't necessarily mean that's a lower standard, but I think that over time you'll see these evolve. They'll probably become more prescriptive over time. So maybe the future is the Climate Bond Initiative's Climate Bond standards. But I think right now, if you look at those standards and the amount of issuance, ICMA ones, in part because it's much more flexible. And we've seen the ASEAN following that. We've seen some of the other countries basing theirs on those standards, and I would imagine that's probably going to be the trend going forward.
Thank you, Mark. On to our second speaker. It's going to be interesting to see the perspective from the rating agency. Another look at the market. What are borrowers looking for? What are investors looking for? Some pricing issues, as I mentioned. Abhishek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And in the presentation, you will find that there are probably some common themes between what Mark already mentioned. So what I will try and do is bring in a different perspective on some of those points, because my presentation probably is slightly more broader in the sense it's not just addressing about sovereign, but larger market interest about green bonds. And then I will sort of expand the topic a bit and drag it into ESG, because in my mind, you cannot completely segregate and stop just at green and not talk about ESG. So first of all, where do we stand? And I will skip through some of the slides or numbers so as not to repeat. But this market started just about a decade back and it's growing very fast. Our expectation is that this year the green bond issuance will touch close to US $200 billion. So it's not a small amount. Second is, if you look at the issuer set, that is widening. So like Mark touched upon, there are a number of sovereigns which issued green bonds for the first time. Increasingly you are finding corporates, because initially this sector was completely led by the multilaterals, the developmental banks, and also commercial banks, which used to then allocate their proceeds to green initiatives. Now you must be wondering that this Paris Climate Agreement is good, but what happens if US pulls off, right? But I mean, despite whatever political statements might be coming out of US, even right now within US, the states themselves are spending significantly on green initiatives and marking proceeds towards these green measures. So I think despite whatever political positioning might be there, we still think even US included remain fairly involved in cutting down on the emission norms. And finally, you are seeing the emergence of Asia and China in particular becoming an important player in the green bond market, and with the likes of Indonesia joining in with the green sukuk. I mean, now you are seeing more countries coming out. From India's side, you have seen more of private companies. So I think you have already started seeing some large issuance across a diverse set within South and Southeast Asia and APAC. So I already touched upon this political push. Despite whatever things you might hear, it is here to stay, because many countries recognize these climate issues they need to be dealt with, and they need to change the way things have been operating in the past. Now you have already seen this chart. I think the main takeaway is the pie is becoming bigger, and second is it is becoming more diverse in set of both number of issuers, the type of issuers, across rating categories and different project types. Now this is the market overview. So if you want to split across different levels, rating categories, countries, this is how the split would look. And in fact, if you would have seen this a couple of years back, you would have seen a lot more concentration either on rating categories or the type of issuers. Now to the point that Europe was clearly at the forefront of these emission related things, but increasingly if you look at the proceeds going towards green initiative, if you look at this particular slide, increasingly you are seeing likes of China, India joining in for green issuance, and overall green is spreading. Now, this is one point I want to touch upon, because while you came across a number of standards, probably what we need to touch upon is why so many standards and what it means, right? So, since these green bond principles are sort of guidelines and they are not mandatory rules, what it means is tomorrow if a sovereign or a company wants to issue a green bond, you can declare yourself to be green. Right? So it's a self-declaration or sort of a self-labeled green bond market, which was in vogue before some of these principles started becoming more solidified, and before the investors started asking, okay, what is different and how are you more committed to green initiatives. So we did a back-testing study on self-labeled green bonds, and clearly a couple of things I would highlight. One is traditional definition of green would probably make us think that it's all about the solar and the wind farms. But if you look at green building, which cut down on emissions, or even mass rapid transportation, and even though this is slightly contentious, even cleaner coal technology, if it cut down on emission, whether it is green or not, and I will touch upon that point, different people have a different viewpoint on whether coal can be less black. So, in the study we did for self-labeled bonds, most of the funding had gone for green, particularly for renewable and green building kind of factors. And overall, I think the focus on replacing coal is widespread, But within Asia Pacific, particularly countries like India, Indonesia, China, still remain fairly reliant on coal. So we cannot completely ignore coal, at least at this stage of development. Now, what do green financiers or the investors worry about? Right? So when we speak with investors, previously you did not have green-only investors. Increasingly, you are also finding like the likes of BlackRock, who are commercially driven and not just driven by social initiatives. Getting into just green bonds means green bonds have evolved as a separate asset class, and that's why a separate green-only fund. And you are increasingly finding some investors classifying some part of their portion of funds as dedicated towards green. Right? So, first thing, the credit risk for a green bond is inherent. Right? So, you might have a great project or great issuance which is going to cut down on emissions significantly, but that does not take away the credit risk in any which way. So, the credit risk still remains central for green bonds. Second is the reporting. What the financiers are worried about is, okay, I am lending these funds for the purpose of being put in for cutting down emission. And this, if you look at these questions, this ties up with the number of principles you have. So the principles about reporting, they had to be there simply because this is a question which is on the mind of investors as to how I see that the funds are actually going towards green initiatives and not into something else. Second is, increasingly, because this market is becoming bigger, investors are looking for independent, either second or third party reports or evaluations to confirm. Think of it more like an audit. It's your own account which then needs to be audited so that a wider set of financial investors can take comfort from it. It's not mandatory, but as the size and issuances increase, this is some kind of a trend that we are noticing, and I will again touch upon this point slightly later in my slide. Greenwashing, Mark already touched upon it. Maybe in the minds of some of the European investors, when we speak with EIB and all, this clean coal technology in China, maybe they think of it more like greenwashing to begin with. But increasingly, the PBOC in China and EIB are coming together to see if there can be some level of harmonization of principles, even while allowing some level of differences between these different standards, given the needs and focus of these countries at this stage. Maybe in future we might come to a standardization. Let's see. Does not seem pretty likely in the immediate future, but given the way the size of the market is growing, you might see investors themselves looking for more standardization and comparability, which so far probably has not been the biggest concern for them. Now, green default, this is interesting, and this has come up in some of our discussions with particularly developmental banks. What they are worried about is there is reporting, there is money which is kept in a separate account, but what if the actual positive impact on the environment is not to the same extent as it was disclosed to begin with? Because that was one of the bases based on which they actually lent to the project or to the company. Right? So they are really concerned about over the lifetime of the project, whether the project will deliver the green benefits that it stated it will. So this is again another important point they are looking at. Now, one point I will touch upon, while yes, we talk about responsible investors, and there are traditional senses of saying, okay, there are conventional investors and then there are responsible investors. I think increasingly you are finding that there is convergence happening. I am not saying they have completely converged already, but you are seeing investors driven by commercial profit increasingly looking at green as not only from a social responsibility point of view. When we were discussing, I think you had one example for the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. When we were speaking with the officials there, what they were saying was, in their mind, in the long term, projects which are environmentally more sustainable will also give better returns. So it's not just that because they want to support the environment, they are investing in it, the hard-earned money on superannuation, but also because they think that will give better returns. So there is some level of convergence which is happening between the conventional and responsible investors. Now, what do green borrowers look for? Obviously, I think the starting point always remains what is the pricing benefit we have. And then there comes this cost element. The ADB report on local currency was pretty good because it identified the cost of issuance comes to between 0.1 to 7 bips of issuance, and that's something which they need to get the benefit in terms of pricing for them to be incentivized about it. Right? One big thing we are seeing is widening of investor base. There are some investors who are not attracted to, let's say, a coal company, which then came out with a green bond only to invest into renewables, and there were some new set of investors which invested. In fact, maybe Park will also touch upon it. In the Indonesian green sukuk also, from what we understand, 20% of the investors were green only. And again, one important point I will bring up here, probably more from the sovereign point of view. What the ministry officials from Indonesia were telling us was that because the investors ask for these reports on a regular basis, they hold them accountable that the government actually delivers on these green emission targets. So I think that is another aspect to look at, not just from the cost perspective, but even from accountability point of view, particularly for some of the governments. Now, pricing premium, it's anecdotal. You don't have empirical evidence, but it is building, and we expect it to increase going forward. On the primary market, there are some signs, but I think it is the secondary market where there are more differences which are playing out in terms of pricing. Now, when we look at green evaluation, and this is the point I was talking earlier, first you had self-label, then you got a yes or no kind of green or not green, then you got shades of green, and now that investors are getting more sophisticated and the market is becoming bigger, there is some need for a common global standard for evaluation. And so we have a green evaluation tool. It is different from a rating. Rating just reflects the credit risk. Green evaluation just reflects the environmental benefit. This can be across currencies, across instruments, sukuk, equity, anything can be rated under this. I will not go into details on this, but basically just think of transparency and governance remain the central pieces. Mitigation is cutting down on emission. Resilience is adapting and making the country or the project more stronger to deal with environmental disasters. Now, just finally closing with the points on ESG. 2 years back when we did this study, most of the companies that we were looking at, ESG factors had close to 70% negative impact. And when we repeated this exercise recently, ESG factors had a fairly even kind of an impact on trade ratings. What this basically means is companies are building up their risk management practices to take into account these environmental, social factors, and therefore they are getting better and not impacting the credit profile negatively all the time. And this is just sort of summarizing the action. Social factors, on the other hand, have been largely negative on the rating. So while they are not as frequent, whenever these factors are there, they have a significant extreme impact on the overall credit profile. So that's why we think ESG would be something which increasingly you will talk about in your future green bond conferences. So with that, I complete my presentation.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. After those two great general overviews, we're going to shift gears now, and we're going to go into some more technical studies. So first, I'll ask Grace to tell us if she agrees with the fact that there are some pricing advantages for borrowers to issue green bonds. So Grace, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pierre. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation is actually complementary to what Mark and Abhishek just talked about. So basically, we will see actually the first three slides. I can just skip very quickly. So green bond has been, green bond market has been developing very fast. And then the GDP and the CDI standard has been the leading global standard. And then here I would like to confirm Abhishek is the GDP standard is actually voluntary standard. So basically, as Mark just mentioned, it's quite flexible, so it's widely accepted. Here is some Some was based on Bloomberg green bond function, so it's disaggregation of green bonds across countries and also sectors. So basically, the U.S., EU, and China are still leading markets in this green bond practice. I will actually formally start from here. So in our study, we try to understand the different parties in this green bond markets. So if you look at the issuer's motivation, as mentioned by the former two panelists, there is some kind of diversification in investor base benefit, and also at the same time, issuers also face substantial cost to become or remain green. So that's why I think Mark said some kind of incentive needs to be provided to foster this green bond market. And also some other motivations has been outlined by ADB green bond study, where the issue earlier this year. You can find it on Asian Bonds Online. It is there. Actually, many of the issuers, they try to boost up reputation and claim to be sustainability to attract more investors of different type, basically. And then from the investors' perspective, actually, the retail market sees an increasing number of ESG-aware investors. And then, as Mark just showed, according to the excess demand or oversubscription, they seem to be relatively less return sensitive. And then, of course, in this green bond market, they face substantial information asymmetry on how to understand whether the bond is green or not. Actually, our study will try to see how this issue can be mitigated later. And then, as Abhishek just mentioned, actually, green bond market has been becoming a more separate asset class in terms of that. Well, on top of conventional market players, some other enhancer participants is important in this green bond market. They include some kind of greenness information providers, such as external reviewer, such as some kind of index, such as some labels or certification. Anything that provides information of greenness will help in this market, given the information asymmetry faced by the investors. Here is some current situation in the green bond markets. So basically, compared to conventional markets, this asset class is still small. So according to a study, the green bond market size represents less than 2% compared to global bond issuance in 2016. And then the two key challenges faced in this green bond market, as outlined by the former two panelists, is the first one is the lack of a universally accepted standard. And the second one is the pricing mechanism in this market is still unclear. Many of these premium or discount actually might be driven by a sizable excess demand instead of a real social or environment benefit. So this chart actually highlights what might actually influence the pricing mechanism. So there is excess demand, so pushing down the price. And then because of this market still small and relatively illiquid, so the financing cost might be also increased according to these pricing factors. So basically, we try to understand whether there is a green premium, and then what might be the factor affected. There are several studies, not many of them, a few of them, trying to capture the green premium. As Abhishek just mentioned, there is no standard way to measure green premium, but people try to benchmark a green bond with some benchmarks. So basically, several studies document negative premium, which is discount, so several bips according to samples. And then also some other studies document no difference of green bond pricing from the benchmarked conventional bonds. So what we do here is actually we try to come up with some kind of 60 paired conventional bonds from Bloomberg. So actually what we have to control the green bond and their conventional bonds to make sure that they have the same issuer, so we control the fundamental. They have the same credit rating, they have the same maturity time, they need to be denominated in the same currency, and then they should share the same bond structure attributes like coupon type needs to be fixed, seniority attributes, option clause, and collateral attributes. So after controlling all these, and then we also need to choose if more than one benchmark conventional bonds is matched, we choose the one with the closest issue date. So after screening, we come up with 60 paired green bonds from 2010 and 2017. And then we try to list their attributes. So we try to compare the yields. Coupon we cannot control, so it's also different. Issue amount we cannot control, so it's different. So what we can see, it seems that there is no significant difference between green bond and their matching. So capital M stands for matching, so matching conventional bonds in terms of yields. And in general, green bond seems to have a significant lower coupon rate, and also their issue amount is much smaller compared to their match benchmark conventional bonds. So to calculate green bond premium, of course, the most straightforward will just minus, take a difference between the two. However, because we are comparing two different markets, so conventional bond markets versus the green bond markets, so liquidity issue is to be controlled. So we have to remove the part that can be explained by liquidity from this kind of difference in yields. So what we do is we try to come up with the most conventional liquidity measure, so bid-ask spread, and then we try to conduct a regression. So the part which can be explained by bid-ask spread in this difference in yield is removed. So what we use as a green bond premium is actually the residue. So the remaining part in the difference of yield between conventional and green bond yields, actually that cannot be explained by a bid-ask spread. So we use the residue from such a regression. This is actually the regression. You can see liquidity significantly increase the yields. This actually lists the distribution of the residue. So on average, we cannot document a very significant either positive or negative green bond premium or discount. So very, very slight 0.4 bit discount. You can see actually the left side is higher. So on general, there is no significant green premium or discount. However, this doesn't necessarily mean green bond is not properly priced, or it doesn't mean there is no green premium. So what we conduct is, after controlling for common pricing factors, we're including this yield level, currency, sector, issue amount, and rating. We try to come up two greenest factors. One is whether a green bond has a CPI certificate mentioned by Mark. The other is whether this green bond has an external independent reviewer, so it's a dummy variable. So here, actually, you can tell from the last two regressions, actually, green bonds, those have a CPI certificate, seems to enjoy something like 9%, 9 bips yield compared to the remaining green bonds. And this CPI independent reviewer actually come up with some kind of 7 bips discount compared to other green bonds. So overall, this result is consistent with what we understand. Actually, because these issuers, they really spend extra investment to lower the investors' information asymmetry. So I think their bonds seems to be able to enjoy a rather great discount on this kind of practice. So overall, the summary and discussion of our study is consistent with the other two panelists. So in general, green premium, we didn't document any significant green premium or discount. And then what is important, it seems that a well-acknowledged standard is important to further develop these green bond markets. And the current green discount or premium might be driven by the excess demand. However, we do believe the equity investors do not necessarily sacrifice their yield forever. So some kind of benefits, I mean, environmental benefits, also social benefits can come into some kind of monetized form. So basically like tax or other financial incentives. So if government can support the green bond market in this way, actually the investors will not necessarily sacrifice a lower yield. So that is what we can draw from the study. So that's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Grace. If I can add my 2 cents to the overall study. In our experience, in ADB's experience, all the green bonds that we have issued, especially in US dollar, let's talk about US dollar because those are probably you include some ADB bonds in your study. Those are directly comparable to our larger bond program, which we call the global bond program, which are sold in large size all around the globe. We've seen better price tension, better performance, also to some extent, but yes, it has to be adjusted to the fact that the size is smaller for green bonds and for, but still, the primary market as well, we've seen better pricing by 1 or 2 weeks. At the end of the day, it is likely the market will go in that direction because for borrowers issuing green bonds, that also has a cost in terms of project selection, in terms of separating the liquidity management, in terms of reporting on the operations and so forth. So an additional cost at the end of the day should be reported. So it looks like we are all agree on this. And now we have a very interesting specific case in the case study. We mentioned at least 3 times about the green sukuk, which was issued by Indonesia. And without further ado, I know we are a bit late, but there are no sessions after this. And I promise the last presentation will last no longer than. I give you 6. I give you even 10 if you wish. So please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peter. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We really appreciate for the invitation from the ADB as well as host the PDFO for this very fruitful discussion this afternoon. I would like to share our knowledge regarding our experience on the issuance of our green global sukuk. In this case, we have been granted as the first ever green global sukuk issuance by sovereign. So basically, I would like to start with the background of when we issue not only the green bonds but the sukuk, to be more flexible, and then there will be a captive market too because of the sukuk. We have very specific investors, especially in the Middle East as well as in Asia. Later, I will show you the case of our late issuance in the sukuk Green Global. And these are actually our internal reason why we issue the green sukuk. First, green. And then for the execution, we have, of course, they need to have what's the proof of our proceeds use. We have to do a periodical report in this case. Then this is the framework that actually we prepare the pillars, we have 4 pillars, the use of proceeds, yeah, we have the clear use of the proceeds is for the green projects. The second one is about the execution and also the the evaluation and project selection. And then we use the management of the proceeds because, as we mentioned earlier, that we not only put the fund on a special account, but how do we manage that? And the last pillar is about the reporting, which is the most important part of the execution. So then there are 9 eligible green sectors that we have that ranging from the light into the dark green. The light one, because of maybe it's not all the components of the project can be categorized as the dark one. Maybe mostly like salary kind of that. So that might not be categorized as dark green. While for the renewable energy, because it has a wide impact, and then most of the components of the projects are, directly impacted to the green, that can be granted a dark green. And then this is actually the evaluation and process. As I mentioned earlier, that we have a support from the UNDP to identify the projects that might be categorized as green. So we use the system called budget tagging process, and UNDP actually help us to identify which of the project that can be categorized as the green one. Because we know that our country, we do it by our internal standard in this case. So this is the case study that I will mention. And here I would like to highlight that the yield that are occur in this transaction, there was the lowest spread in US Treasury to our yield. That was the lowest one ever from our. And then, as we mentioned earlier, that we had a quite significant low yield in this case. Even though we use sukuk, but we still can manage to have that, get a good yield. Okay, this is the I will very quickly. And lesson learned from this, we divided into 2 parts, pre and then post of the issuance. The pre-issuance, actually we need to do the framework as well as we use the benchmark for the investor. In this case, we mitigate this kind of obstacles by asking also for from the external support. And then we do second opinion with the CCRO, and then it was very helpful, as well as from the UNDP in identifying the projects. And for the post issuance, we face a problem, and we will face a challenge in reporting. But we do consultation also with the auditors, the independent auditors, to give us any comments on how to report and then how to be transparent to the investor. That's all about my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yadi. Since we're out of time, I'll just summarize in 2 words: an exciting and growing market. But I will still leave 3 minutes for questions. So is there anybody in the room who would like to seek clarifications? Ken.
Yeah, I've got a question for Mark and Abhishek in connection with green bonds. I mean, are either of you aware of an instance whereby an issuer has been found to be in breach of the green bond principles, and what were the repercussions of that breach?
I could be quick because I personally am not aware, but maybe Abhishek.
No, it's such a nascent market that the issuances have just started. So we have still not come across a case where there has been a breach already. I think it's more about monitoring, reporting on a regular basis. In future, there's something we have to watch out for, particularly for self-labeled green bonds.
I suppose there is no real legal issue here, because as any issuer can label itself green. I guess the judgment will be from the investors. If you found in breach of your commitment, that will definitely have an impact on your cost of funds. So there is a strong incentive not to be breach. Any other question? Come on, be courageous. No volunteers? All right, that means you're free for the day. Thank you very much. And another round of applause.
Thank you very much, our speakers and moderators. Before leaving, I just have 3 things to announce. Please bear with me. So first, let me emphasize again that if you are going out for dinner or to anywhere this evening, please kindly leave your name, your contact number, and places you plan to go at the hotel's concierge. And the staff contacts can be found in the QR code. I know that we're being a little nosy here, but your safety is our first priority. And second thing is, there is a feedback form in your folder, so please remember to bring it tomorrow and you can fill in and give it to our staff. And lastly, tomorrow, both hotels' checkout time is 11 a.m., so please take out your luggage and leave them at the hotel's lobby. And that's all. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you.
Yes, I am.
The event is also at 7:45 a.m. tomorrow, as usual.
For those that are tomorrow. Yes.
Ito ko na. Bahay mo ko painin din na.
Ini kalau tahu.
Kamu
Would end up on the bus.
Thank you.